In the vast and ruthless history of the Roman Empire, countless stories of bloodshed and cruelty stand out, but few are as horrifying and unforgettable as the death of St. Lawrence. His ordeal was not the swift strike of a sword, nor the instant fall of an axe. Instead, it was a death by fire, stretched over iron bars, roasted alive on a blazing gridiron while his executioners mocked his faith. Yet, what makes Lawrence's martyrdom so haunting is not only the brutality of his death, but the words he reportedly spoke while burning a defiance that turned his torment into legend. St. Lawrence was not born into nobility or wealth. He came from humble beginnings in the Roman province of Hispania, modern-day Spain. From an early age, he was drawn to Christianity, which at the time was spreading through the empire in secret gatherings, whispered prayers, and underground networks of believers. It was a dangerous faith to adopt. Christianity was still illegal, seen as a threat to Roman tradition, and punishable by torture or death. But Lawrence was not afraid. His unwavering devotion led him to Rome, where he became a deacon under Pope Sixtus II. As a deacon, Lawrence's responsibilities were immense. He was entrusted with the church's sacred treasures, not gold or silver in the traditional sense, but the care of the poor, the sick, the widows, and the orphans. Lawrence distributed resources to those in need, becoming a symbol of Christian charity in an empire that valued power, hierarchy, and conquest. His work earned him admiration among the faithful, but it also drew the attention of the Roman authorities, who despised the growing influence of Christians in their city. In the year 58 AD, Emperor Valerian issued an edict of persecution against the Christians. Bishops, priests, and deacons were to be executed. The aim was to break the church by cutting off its leadership. Pope Sixtus II was one of the first victims, seized during a church service and executed almost immediately. But before his death, he is said to have told Lawrence, "You will follow me soon." It was not a warning, but a prophecy, and it would come true in the most gruesome way imaginable. After the Pope's execution, Lawrence became the prime target of the Roman prefect. The authorities knew he was responsible for the church's wealth, and they demanded he turn it over to the empire. Lawrence, however, was not a man to be intimidated. He requested 3 days to gather the treasures of the church. The prefect, greedy for riches, granted him this time. But Lawrence had something else in mind. Instead of gold or jewels, Lawrence gathered the poor, the sick, and the destitute of Rome, the very people he had been caring for. When the prefect returned, expecting overflowing treasures, Lawrence presented these people before him and declared, "These are the treasures of the church." This act of defiance enraged the prefect. Not only had Lawrence mocked his demand, but he had humiliated the empire by openly valuing the weak and the suffering over wealth and power. To the Romans, this was an insult that could not be ignored. Lawrence would be made into an example, a warning of what awaited anyone who dared to defy imperial authority. Yet, his punishment was not to be quick or clean. The prefect desired something far more theatrical, a slow execution that would burn fear into the hearts of every Christian who heard of it. The method chosen was a gridiron, a massive iron grill placed over burning coals, where Lawrence would be laid alive, his flesh roasted until death claimed him. The execution was staged publicly, as so many Roman tortures were, not just to kill a man, but to create a spectacle of power. Witnesses describe the scene with gruesome detail. Lawrence was stripped, bound, and stretched across the iron bars of the grill. Beneath him, the flames roared, fueled by the executioners. To prolong his agony, the heat was unbearable. His skin blistered and blackened. His body convulsed in violent spasms. The smell of burning flesh filled the air as the crowd watched. But Lawrence was no ordinary victim. Even in the midst of unimaginable pain, he is said to have shown no fear. Instead, he mocked his tormentors. According to early Christian accounts, at one point during his roasting, he turned to the executioners and said with dark irony, "Turn me over. I am done on this side." These words, if true, were not only a final act of defiance, but a profound demonstration of faith, a refusal to allow his killers the satisfaction of seeing him broken. The executioners, enraged by his boldness, stoked the flames higher, determined to finish their gruesome task. Still, Lawrence's spirit did not waver. He endured until his final breath, dying as a martyr in the most agonizing of deaths, yet leaving behind a legacy of courage and defiance that Rome could not extinguish. The martyrdom of St. Lawrence became one of the most famous stories of early Christianity, spreading rapidly through the empire. His death was remembered not just as another act of persecution, but as a turning point, a moment where cruelty was met with unshakable faith, and where torture became testimony. To the Christians, Lawrence was not a victim, but a victor. His body destroyed, but his spirit triumphant. The prefect who ordered his death had intended to send a message of fear, but instead, he had created a martyr whose memory would inspire generations. The story of Lawrence roasted alive on the gridiron was told and retold in hushed voices and hidden gatherings, reminding the faithful that even in the face of unbearable suffering, faith could not be destroyed. His death also carried powerful symbolism. The gridiron became an emblem of his martyrdom, depicted in countless works of art, from medieval paintings to Renaissance masterpieces. For centuries, St. Lawrence was remembered not only as a protector of the poor, but also as a man who defied tyranny with both courage and wit, turning even his execution into a moment of spiritual triumph. Yet, behind the legend lies the brutal reality of what Lawrence endured. To imagine the sheer agony of his final hours is to confront the darkest side of human cruelty. The Roman Empire had perfected torture as theater, turning executions into performances meant to crush hope. But in Lawrence's case, their cruelty had the opposite effect: to immortalize him, giving strength to the very movement they sought to destroy. And so, his story became etched in the foundations of Christian history, echoing through centuries as a reminder of the price of faith, the power of defiance, and the resilience of the human spirit. The death of St. Lawrence did not end with the extinguishing of his life. In fact, it marked the beginning of something far greater, a legacy that Rome's fire could not consume. While his body was destroyed, his story became immortal, carried in whispers through the streets of Rome, and later echoed in the prayers of millions across the world. Almost immediately after his martyrdom, Christians began venerating Lawrence as a saint. In an era where Christianity was still underground, stories of courage like his were lifelines of hope. To the persecuted faithful, Lawrence was a hero who had faced the worst tortures the empire could devise and emerged victorious. Not in flesh, but in spirit. The image of him laid out on the iron gridiron became a symbol of endurance and faith stronger than flame. What makes his story even more haunting is the memory of his final words. Whether he truly said, "Turn me over, I am done on this side," or whether it was a line added by early Christians to emphasize his defiance, the effect was the same. It stripped the power of fear away from the Roman authorities. Imagine, for a moment, the prefect's rage, expecting Lawrence to scream and beg for mercy, yet instead hearing him mock the very flames consuming his body. That single phrase turned what should have been a terrifying spectacle into a story of unbreakable courage, retold endlessly for generations. Soon after his death, Christians risked everything to recover his remains. His body, though charred and broken, was buried with reverence along the Via Tiburtina, a road leading out of Rome. Over his tomb, believers later constructed one of the most important churches of Christian history, the Basilica of San Lorenzo fuori le Mura, or St. Lawrence outside the walls. Even today, this church stands as one of Rome's great basilicas, a place where pilgrims come to honor the man who burned but did not break. The cult of St. Lawrence grew quickly. In Rome, he became one of the city's most beloved martyrs, second only to St. Peter and St. Paul. His feast day, celebrated on August 10th, spread across Christendom, turning his name into one of the most recognized of all early saints. By the Middle Ages, his story had inspired countless works of art, from manuscripts that depicted his torture in vivid illustration to great paintings and sculptures commissioned by the church. The gridiron, once an instrument of agony, became a holy symbol, held in paintings by Lawrence himself as if mocking the empire that had tried to destroy him. And yet, beyond art and ritual, there was something deeper in the story of Lawrence. His life and death represented a clash between two worldviews: the Roman Empire's reliance on power, wealth, and fear, and the Christian devotion to faith, humility, and sacrifice. When Lawrence presented the poor and the weak as the treasures of the church, he made a statement that echoed long after his death. He redefined wealth in spiritual terms, stripping the empire of its dominance in that one act of defiance. That message, paired with his martyrdom, carried extraordinary weight. But the horror of his death cannot be ignored. To be roasted alive on a gridiron was not simply punishment, it was theater. The Romans staged executions to be lessons in obedience, spectacles of pain meant to crush the will of those who watched. In this, Lawrence's execution was meant to silence Christians with terror. Instead, it amplified their faith. The cruelty of the prefect became proof of the empire's corruption, while Lawrence's calm endurance became proof of Christianity's truth. Later accounts claimed miracles followed his death. The poor he protected were said to pray at his grave and find healing. Rome itself, within a generation, began to soften toward the very faith it once persecuted. Less than a century later, Christianity would rise from the catacombs to become the dominant religion of the empire. And in that transformation, the story of martyrs like Lawrence played an unforgettable role. His death also entered folklore in strange and symbolic ways. In Spain, he became the patron saint of cooks and comedians because of his remark on the grill. In Rome, he was seen as the protector of the city's poor, a saint who embodied both compassion and resilience. His image, often depicted with a gridiron in hand, became a familiar sight in Christian iconography across Europe. Yet, when we strip away the layers of legend, what remains is the brutal truth of what happened on that day in 58 AD. A man was burned alive, his body consumed by flames, because he refused to renounce his faith and betray the values he stood for. It is this reality, the agony of flesh against fire, the defiance of spirit against cruelty, that makes his story not only unforgettable, but also deeply disturbing. When we remember St. Lawrence today, it is not simply as a holy figure from distant history. Martyrdom is a reminder of the extremes of human cruelty, but also of the heights of human courage. It shows us how systems of power often try to enforce obedience with fear, and how those who resist can transform suffering into something greater than themselves. His story lingers as both warning and inspiration, warning us of how brutal authority can become, and inspiring us with the resilience of a man who met death with strength and even wit. As time went on, St. Lawrence's name spread beyond Rome. Churches across Europe were dedicated to him, and countless generations invoked his story in sermons, art, and devotion. Even today, nearly 2,000 years later, the memory of his death remains vivid. In Rome, in Spain, and in Christian communities worldwide, his feast day is not only a moment of prayer, but also a retelling of the fire that failed to consume him. For the channel Torture's Room, his story fits within the dark and unsettling history of torture and execution. But it also carries something more. It is not merely horror for horror's sake, but horror transformed into hope, cruelty turned into legend, and a death that became larger than the empire that ordered it. And so, when we revisit the story of St. Lawrence, the man roasted alive on a griddle, we confront one of history's most gruesome deaths. But in his agony, we also see defiance. In his suffering, we also see victory. The flames that destroyed his body only lit the fire of faith that spread across the world. This is the paradox of torture. It is meant to erase, but in cases like this, it immortalized. Lawrence's name stands as proof that even the cruelest executions cannot silence conviction. His life ended on the flames of a gridiron, but his story still burns bright centuries later. If you've been moved by this chilling but powerful history, make sure to subscribe to Torture's Room. Here, we uncover the darkest truths of the past, stories of cruelty, torture, and executions that shape the world we live in today. Hit the like button, share this with others who seek to understand the brutal side of history, and stay tuned for more stories that reveal the terrifying, unforgettable realities of human history. Because in every tale of torture, there is not only horror, but also a message about power, about faith, and about the resilience of the human spirit. And no story embodies that more than the martyrdom of St. Lawrence, the man who laughed at death as the flames consumed him.